it got real quiet. And not just like quiet, like nobody was talking, but all the birds stopped, all the crickets stopped, all the cicadas stopped. And it was noticeable, but we really didn't think anything of it. And we just kind of went about talking. And then a few minutes later, I heard the best way I can describe it is like a woof. Similar to the way a bear sounds.
Okay.
When you kind of get too close. I don't know if you've had any experience with bears, but both me and Chris being from Idaho, we've, had our experiences with bears, black bears especially, and they make this kind of go woof, woof kind of a sound. Just kind of I see you, you're in my space, you need to get away. Okay. But this was much louder than any black bear I'd ever heard. I mean, it was very loud, very close. But one thing I vividly remember is in my mind, I'm telling myself, well, there's black bears in Missouri, but this doesn't sound like a black bear. And one thing I also remember is we never heard jaw snapping, which is very indicative of bears after they do the wolf. They kind of clack their jaws together as like a warning and just kind of to get away. We heard this over and over again. So we kind of talked about it between ourselves, and we're like, well, there's some people in the class that are probably just trying to pull a prank on us, pull a fast one, hee hee ha ha. We scared the big football players. So we kind of just brushed it off and didn't think anything of it. Then a few more minutes goes by, and I can only describe it as a bang. It was just the loudest noise that I had ever heard next to being next to a cannon. And this entire cabin shed just shook. I mean, the whole front to back, left to right, up, down, it moved. And I immediately jumped out of my bunk. And at this point, I'm standing in the middle of this 10 by 10 shed. And the entire cabin begins to shake back and forth. Violently shaking back and forth. It was so much movement that it actually shook Chris out of his bunk and onto the floor. And like I said, Chris was bigger than I am. And it seemed like it went on forever. And now, in reality, maybe 30 seconds, maybe a minute, but it just felt like eternity that this thing was shaking. But it was never woofing at us again. It was never screaming or ground. Just the whole cabin was shaking. Okay. And when I say violent, it was violent enough that the 2x4 rafters that made up the rafter portion of this cabin, one actually snapped and fell to the floor. Wow. And the only thing that could go through my head was that whatever this thing is, it's going to come through the wall and it's going to have us. And I grabbed a piece of this 2x4 rafter and just stood in the middle of the cabin screaming my head off back at this thing. I mean, in my mind, that fight or flight kicks in and I'm going, we're going to fight for our lives. There's nothing else that we're going to have to do. Like I said, like I seen it went on forever. It went on long enough that my voice went hoarse. I couldn't even scream anymore. And then just as soon as it started, everything stopped. Wow. And everything went quiet. Eerily dead, silent. Again, no crickets, no cicadas, no birds, no anything. For the rest of this night, Chris never got off the floor. I mean, neither one of us slept at all, but he never moved a muscle off that floor. And all I did the rest of the night was stood in the middle of this cabin holding onto this 2x4. I mean, fingers cramping, forearms cramping. And I mean, in my mind, this thing was right outside and it was still coming in. And the only thing that I could think is we just kept praying for sunlight. Please let the sun come up. Please let the sun come up. And finally, the sun came up. And, you can call it fear, self-preservation. Like I said, we did not move. I sure as heck wasn't going out that door, and Chris wasn't even getting off the floor to go out the door. After a while, the sun had been up, I don't know, roughly 30, 40 minutes, I'd imagine. The door opened. And it was the property manager who ran this massive property and one of the professors from the class. So we walked out of the cabin, and I just vividly remember smelling this. Best way I could describe it, if you've ever been to a swamp or a lake after it's flooded, just putrid, rotty kind of a smell.
Okay.
And when we got out of the cabin, we saw that the cabin had been actually pushed off of the cinder block foundation onto the ground. The side that had the window on it had two very large mud marks, is the best way I could describe them, from the very top of where the roof and the wall connect, all the way down about 3 or 4 feet, probably within 2 feet of the bottom of this cabin. And I just as a rough guess, I would say somewhere between 10 to 12 inches across were these mud marks. The roof shingles, the two first rows of the roof shingles on that side had actually been ripped off the cabin and were laying on the ground.
Wow.
It looked like something had grabbed a hold of them and ripped them off, and they were laying on the ground. Now, with the cabin being as tall as it was, the shed and the cinder blocks, I would probably say that the roof line was every bit of 11 to 12 feet off of the ground. The property manager could clearly see that we were shaken. I mean, obviously these two giant college football players who thought they were kings of the world are, scared to death. And he just kind of chuckled and just nonchalantly goes, "Well, I guess you boys met Bruce." and there was a pause, and he goes, "Yeah, I'm not really sure who or what it is, but he don't seem to take kindly to people in this last cabin, especially men."
Thanks.
And I went from 0 to angry. And so I asked in like a very angry and shocked tone, "You mean to tell me this has happened before? Why didn't you warn us or anything?"